Thank you. Okay, thank you all. We have two presentations this afternoon, and we are going to try a new way of collecting questions in both of the presentations. The goal is to try to focus on key questions that most of you care about. So we're going to use a platform called Mentimeter. It'll allow you to send questions and vote for the questions you'd most liked answered live during the presentation. So there's a code you can scan in, or you can go to menti.com and type in the code. Once you're there, you can type in questions. You can also vote on questions that other people have posted. Please make sure to look through the other questions before you add new ones, because somebody else may have asked that question, so just vote for the one that you've got. We do have moderators reviewing the questions before they get posted, just so you know. That's part of our process, but you should see them up there. And as you vote, you'll see questions rise to the top, and that way we will be able to sort of gauge what topics you want to talk about. So this is new for all of us. It may be complicated, and I ask for your patience today as we all try it out, and I also will welcome your feedback on this after we get through the afternoon. You can let me know what you thought of this. Again, and if you don't get your questions answered today, ask JFO at leg.state.vt.us is always a useful email for us. So we're going to have two specific pressing policy issues. Again, the goal of these and all the presentations is simply to provide you with some information and context as you prepare for the coming session. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who's going to walk you through education finance. Yes, we will leave this up. We're going to leave this up for a few minutes, and then Julia will. Yeah. And we can always, if you are having problems, let me know and we can put it back up. Sound good? Okay. Yeah. You're going to do it? Okay.
I will also say for folks, as I scroll past this slide, when I get the majority of head nods or people looking my way, that I believe this is included in the packet materials to the QR code. So if over the course of the session, one of your seatmates comes in, you can point them to this. I believe it's included in the housing presentation, so not in the Ed Finance one. People generally ready to get going? Yes, thank you. Senator Clarkson is holding it up in the VHFA. Okay, great. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to see so many familiar faces and new ones as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. I focus on education finance and the Education Fund. I'm also joined by our new colleague, Ezra, who will be helping work on education finance issues. So now we're a team of two, which is really exciting. So we're focusing on the Education Fund today, and this is a slide that you saw earlier this morning in Emily and Chris's presentation. And you'll see this large bar here where about 80% of K through 12 education funds are state funds from the Education Fund. So this is a really big chunk of funds that the state is spending on public education. I know it's also been a topic of great interest, and so we're going to be diving into the December 1 letter, and we'll be talking about the Ed Fund as a whole in the context of the December 1 letter, and also where you all are going over the course of the session. So before diving into the nitty-gritty, if you are to walk away with 3 or 4 key takeaways from today's talk, I am hoping that maybe these are the 3 key takeaways. 1, I want to reiterate that the December 1 letter really is a starting point for education finance deliberations. It's in no way final, and there's going to be a lot of information and local and state decisions that are made between now and the end of the session that are going to greatly influence all of the policy choices that you all need to make over the course of the session. So it's really a starting point. 2, that the education fund is very unique, and one of the ways that it's unique is that it's a statewide fund and that all spending decisions and revenues are interconnected. We'll talk about this in more detail. But basically it means that all decisions made at the state level, made at the local level, affect the entire system, be it expenditures, revenues, or other policy choices. And lastly, that you all are going to be working throughout the session to set the yields and property tax rates, we'll talk about this in more detail what that means, to fully fund the education fund. And when you put all of these pieces together, it means that there's a lot of really unique considerations for Vermont policymakers because of the structure of the Ed Fund. So before I get started, for those of you who know me, maybe this slide is not too much of a surprise. There's a few caveats that I want to let you know about. One, I'm focusing on state education funds. So this presentation is really not talking about federal funds. There are a lot of federal funds that do come to the state to fund education. We're not talking about those here, but it's important to keep in mind that there's more dollars being spent on education than solely what we're talking about. This is also a high-level overview of the education fund. So those folks who may be into the weeds of ed finance will notice that there's some pieces that I may be glossing over. That's intentional because we only have about 40 minutes to cover that ed fund. So there's a list of resources at the end of the presentation, which I would encourage you to go and look at to understand in more detail and understand some of those more specific terms that we generally use. And lastly, I want to reiterate that JFO is nonpartisan. This presentation, all of our presentations are nonpartisan. We're not providing any sort of policy recommendations or evaluations, but really just trying to provide you with the best information so you all can make informed decisions. So starting out with the December 1 letter. This is setting the stage for ed finance deliberations at the local and at the state level. As you likely saw in the news, it came out on Monday. It's an important document. I've included a few screenshots from the headlines, not all of the headlines. But we see, from Ethan Weinstein at Digger, an eagerly anticipated December 1 letter. Vermont's tax department projects 5.9% property tax increases next year. We see from 7 Days and Vermont Public and NBC5. Lots of other newspapers as well, but it certainly made the headlines. So I want to talk about, we know it's relevant. I know you all know it's relevant. So I want to talk about what it is. So first, starting about what is the purpose and context of the December 1 letter. It really acts as the starting point for education finance deliberations at the local and at the state level. It helps school boards understand the tax implications of the budgets that they're currently building. And I also want to say it forecasts potential, highlight on the potential, tax rates, average bill changes, and other ed fund parameters. It's really a ministerial task that, at least the forecasting piece is ministerial, that JFO and the tax department and AOE do in consensus to really create a starting point of if all of these rules were followed, here's our best estimate right now. All of this data is going to change between now and the end of the session. Local districts will be making budgeting decisions, local voters will be voting on those budgets, and you all as policymakers will also be making decisions about the education fund. I also want to note that the requirements that we use to solve for the December 1 letter are only applicable for the December 1 letter. So there's all sorts of things that we have to assume in the background. Average bill change is the same across non-homestead and homestead, and we need to assume that, we need to assume a lot. It's actually included in the letter itself. That's why I've included this screenshot. You see the yellow box. The commissioner himself puts in the letter, here are the mandated modeling assumptions we need to include. But after the December 1 letter, it's up to policymakers how you want to do it. So the December 1 letter is the part of a long process for education finance. That process is kind of circular, right? It's hard to say this is the starting point, this is the ending point. But one way to think about it is that school boards begin to build and prepare their school budgets sometime in the summer or fall. They're working on those budgets, and then December 1, the commissioner publishes the December 1 letter. And this forecasts rates for the fiscal year given all of these assumptions, given our best available data that's going to change. So then using that December 1 letter, school boards continue to prepare their budgets, and then they warn those budgets for voters. Their decisions are informed by the December 1 letter. Then in March, usually around town meeting, but in Vermont, there's no hard and fast rules for most things, so it's different in some school districts, but usually at town meeting, voters approve or vote to approve those school budgets. The General Assembly then sets the property tax rates and the yields at the level necessary to ensure that all school budgets that are voter approved, there's enough money to fund those school budgets. That's done in the yield bill, which is an annual bill that you pass. Then the Department of Taxes sets those official rates based off of what you've all passed in the yield bill. Towns then administer this statewide education property tax. And then taxpayers pay the education property tax. It's a statewide tax to the statewide fund. And school districts administer those budgets that have been approved by voters. So I guess I show you this to show that the December 1 letter is a step in the process, but it's obviously not binding, right? It's right at the beginning of this process. So what does it tell us? It provides preliminary projections for a number of factors, everything from education expenditures, pupil counts, grand list, and those are used to inform the rest of the calculations. Some are published directly in the letter, like this screenshot, which shows AOE's projection of education spending growth from FY25 to FY26 of about 6%. Or average per pupil spending, we'll talk about what that term means in a bit, of 7%. Others are included in the background, like how much is the grand list going to grow? We take that from the state economists. And then using all of these projections and all of this preliminary data, the December 1 letter provides an estimate of property tax rates and average bill growth for the coming fiscal year. This is based off of all of that preliminary data. So this is where that 5.9% that we saw in the headlines, this is where it comes from. A line in the December 1 letter that says, given all of these assumptions that we need to make for the December 1 letter, but we don't need to make in law, this is what we're estimating, 5.9% increase on average in education tax bills for the state. So this is what it tells us. What doesn't it tell us? It doesn't present final data for the coming fiscal year. It does not present final property tax rates, nor property tax bill growth. It doesn't present final education expenditures or final education appropriations. It doesn't present final education fund revenues. So it's really just presenting these preliminary projections, so we've got a starting point, but the final numbers will depend in part on local decisions and in part on state decisions. So, in a nutshell, that's the December 1 letter, what it does and doesn't tell us. And so, the next piece is thinking about, okay, so this is the December 1 letter. How do we think about that in the context of Vermont's education fund? Because we're in the beginning of the biennium, it's important to review how Vermont's unique formula works. It's unique from other funds in the state, and I know Chris spoke about this morning, but I think one way that's helpful to think about the education fund and how it's different from other budgets or funds is to think about you're going grocery shopping. You know, usually if you've got a grocery budget, you say, okay, I have $100 to spend at the grocery store. You walk through the grocery store and you start to fill up that cart, right? And you're counting down from 100. How much can I put in the cart for my grocery budget? Once you spend all of your dollars, usually you go to the checkout line, unless you really need to buy something else, and then you'll start to think about, okay, where can I pull other funds, right, to put more in that cart? The education fund is the opposite. You start out and you push that cart around the grocery store and you say, what do I need to put into this grocery cart? And once that grocery cart is full, you say, okay, I have $100, but this is how much I need to pay for in the grocery cart. How am I going to figure out how to raise enough more so that I can pay for that whole grocery cart? So it's kind of inverse. I like to think of it as a reverse revenue model. So this means that local and state decisions fill the cart first, and then the legislature needs to figure out how to pay for it. So Vermont's education finance system couples both local and state decisions. Expenditures, those are determined, and then revenues need to fully fund those expenditures. And generally, property tax rates are set in order to ensure that the expenditures are fully funded. I also want to note that all education property taxes are dedicated to the statewide fund. Yes, there's cash flow that sometimes goes between towns and districts, but all education property taxes are state education property taxes. And because of this system, which is different from other states where there's no local share and no state share, there's, again, unique considerations for Vermont policymakers. So we're going to first focus on the expenditure side of things because that's really where a lot of the pieces of the puzzle, I guess, get hammered out first. So the education fund is the total cost of public education in Vermont. Expenditure decisions are determined at the local and at the state level. So at the local level, school districts, they're building budgets that must be approved by local voters. At the state level, the state is setting certain appropriations and categorical aid. They're also passing policies that impact local school budgets. Local school budgets may be making decisions that impact state policy choices. So the two kind of go hand in hand, right? The state is making choices that impact local school districts, and local school districts are making choices that impact the state. I also want to note there's one other piece of the puzzle that's not pictured here, which is the federal decisions. We're not talking about federal dollars, but I think it would be remiss to not talk about the fact that there are federal funds flowing into the state. There's also federal policies that impact the way that education must be provided in the state. So that's kind of the other, often invisible piece of the puzzle that we need to contend with. So we take the sum of all local spending decisions across the state. We've got different school districts making different choices. We add it with all of the statewide spending decisions, and together that creates the total expenditures in the education fund. All of the revenue that we need to raise needs to make sure that this green box, this education fund, is fully funded. So in the December 1 letter, education fund expenditures were forecasted to be about $2.4 billion. And this helps us understand the scale of education spending and other spending on education in Vermont. Also the distribution of funds across the different categories. So what you can see here is the education payment. This top line represents a little over 80% of the forecasted appropriation out of the education fund. Again, I want to reiterate, this is preliminary, this is a projection. It's going to be up to all of you and local school districts. But the education payment, this is really most of it. And that makes up all of those school district budgets after taking out what we call offsetting revenues. So school districts that are getting grants for specific purposes or special education aid, we take that out. Everything else that needs to be funded by the state is summed up in the education payment. So visually, this is what that looks like. That big blue, I guess it's a piece of the pie. This is the education payment. Included in here is our salaries and benefits, those personnel costs that really make up a large chunk of spending on education. But there's also other pieces in here. So if a school district has a leaky roof and they need to fix the roof, that's going to fit into education payment. School construction, a bond payment, that's also going to fit into the education payment. So anything that's not covered by those offsetting revenues but needs to be funded by the state, it's covered by the education payment. So we've been talking a lot about what does the education fund and expenditures look like at the state level, but we know that there's school districts across the state, many of whom are making different decisions. And so one way to think about understanding or comparing the two as sort of an apples to apples comparison is with something called per pupil spending. This is a technical term. It's defined in statute. You can think of it as per weighted pupil. The technical term is per pupil spending. But really what it is it's calculated by taking a school district's education spending, which is really their piece of that education payment, that big blue chunk, however much that school district has in that education payment. So that's everything that they're spending that's not getting a direct offsetting revenue. And it's divided by a school district's weighted pupils. For the Ed Finance weeds, we're talking about long-term weighted average daily membership. For everyone else, we're talking about weighted pupils. And really what that means is it's essentially how many kids that you have on average in that school, plus weights, which are used to adjust student counts for certain circumstances where there may be a higher cost or a lower cost to educate certain students. So we take their ed spending, we divide it by their weighted pupil count, and that gives us per pupil spending. And that's an apples to apples comparison across the state after factoring in weights for each district's spending decisions, regardless of how many students they have. This is also an important number and one I focus on a lot because it impacts local property tax rates. We're going to go into a little bit more detail in a minute about property taxes, but this is impacting that homestead rate. And it's really varied across the state. So what we're looking at here is a map of school districts in the state for FY25. So this is the current school year, the current fiscal year, per pupil spending by district. And I've included this because the yield bill that was passed last year required the commissioner to include in his letter the range of per pupil spending. So we can see that essentially between the lowest per weighted pupil spending district and the highest, there's a bit over 8,000 per weighted pupil in terms of spending difference. So it varies. So now we're going to move from the spending side of things into the funding side of things. We've talked about how education expenditures are determined at a high level, and now we're going to talk about where the money is coming from. So the education fund has multiple revenue sources. And as we've mentioned, expenditure needs determine revenue needs. And so we can think of the Ed Fund as being supported by essentially two revenue categories: property tax revenues and non-property tax revenues. So these two categories can be shown in this pie chart. Property taxes are shown in orange. So there's two property tax pie slices, and then all of the other non-property tax revenues, which are shown in blue. There's two slices for the property tax because we have two ways of classifying property. Talk about that in a couple of minutes. But we can see together homestead and non-homestead property taxes make up over half of education fund revenues. The other pieces of the pie are sales and use tax, a portion of purchase and use, meals and rooms, lottery proceeds, transfer from Medicaid, other sources. So that's really representing all of these small blue bars. So annually, property taxes are set to fully fund Vermont's education system. We need to make sure that there's sufficient revenues to balance the education fund. So we calculated this green statewide education fund, right? This is the sum of all local and spending decisions. But we need to make sure that there's enough revenue to fill that box. So we start out, we take all of the non-property revenues. So those were those blue slices on the previous slide. So that's our sales and use, purchase and use, lottery, et cetera. And then everything else that's left over, we need to fill with property taxes. So you can think of that blue bar shrinks, we need to fill more with property taxes. If that green bar grows, all else equal, we need to fill more with property taxes. The converse is true. So if we have a gangbusters year with sales and use tax, we're probably not going to need to raise as much in property taxes. So there's two types of property taxes. There's homestead, and this is essentially where somebody lives and all the land that surrounds that home. There's non-homestead, and this is literally all other taxable properties. So this includes short-term rentals, long-term rentals, deer camp, second homes, businesses, restaurants, everything. And then based on the property type, a property owner will pay a different rate. Homestead tax rates are proportional to district per pupil spending. So remember we talked about per pupil spending. There is that map of Vermont with the different blue districts based off of the education spending divided by the long-term weighted average daily membership, the weighted pupils. So homestead rates, those are proportional to that per pupil spending. This is also where income sensitivity or the property tax credit comes into play. So for homestead, most Vermonters pay some proportion of their homestead tax on income, maybe all. So we've got proportional spending, proportional tax rates. This is where the yields come into play. The yields, it's a number that we calculate, and it's used essentially to help determine those proportional tax rates that are different across every district. I also want to note that income, the income property tax credit, that's also dependent on per pupil spending. So if a person is paying their property taxes on property or on income, either way, it's going to be adjusted based off of their district's per pupil spending decisions. The non-homestead rate is uniform across the state. So if your business is in a really high spending district or a really low spending district, you're going to have the same non-homestead rate. And then we take the value of the property, multiply it by the rate, and that gives us the tax bill. Property tax rates are set by the General Assembly. So, as I keep alluding to, the yield bill, this is the piece of legislation that is determining how you're going to fill that property tax box that you need to fill, right? So the proportion that's raised from homestead property and the proportion that's raised from non-homestead property is really a policy choice. And that's up to the General Assembly. It doesn't matter what the December 1 letter says in terms of making that policy choice, unless you all decide it matters what the December 1 letter says. So we have our two types of property, our homestead and then our non-homestead, everything else. And we need to figure out how to fill that remainder of the education fund. Because it's a policy choice, you can choose how to do that. You could choose to raise the vast bulk of it on non-homestead and just a sliver of it on homestead. You could choose to do half and half, raise half of the necessary revenues on homestead, the other half on non-homestead, or you could decide to make any proportion that you want. It's really a policy choice. And so for those of you who have been on Ways and Means or Finance or education committees, you'll often see me and now Ezra running around the State House with the Education Fund Outlook. And basically what that's doing is it's showing, okay, we're updating all of the spending, we're updating the revenues, here's the policy choices that you're grappling with. We've got this budget sheet, so to speak, to help you understand what are all the pieces in the education fund that are fitting together to fill this box. And we do that based off of the direction of all of you in terms of how to solve for these yields and how to solve for these property tax rates. So in closing, this slide should look the same. These were my key takeaways that I started out with. The December 1 letter, it's a starting point, right? It's the starting point for property tax and ed finance deliberations. It's in no way final. The data that we use for that December 1 letter will be updated. I also want to note, again, that the ed fund revenues and expenditures are interconnected. So all the decisions, revenue or expenditure, local or state, are impacting everything else in the education fund. And lastly, it's up to the General Assembly over the course of the session to determine how you want to move forward. How do you want to set those revenues in order to ensure that the expenditures are fully funded? These are the resources I mentioned. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go and check them out. These are some from JFO, AOE, Department of Taxes. On this education tab from JFO, this is where we're posting our education fund outlooks that many committees are looking at over the course of the session. There's also some 101 resources that we're always trying to add to. So those are my remarks that I have prepared. I know that we have also been collecting questions in Mentimeter, so I would encourage you, if you had questions over the course of this presentation that you haven't put into Mentimeter, to check out what's in there, vote up the ones that you're interested in, or put in your own, and I will.
Put that slide back up.
Yes.
Would you also tell them they're anonymous questions?
They're anonymous as well, so none of your colleagues are going to know who asked what, unless you tell them. Sure.
This was a good one. This was the first one.
Okay, do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
I can read it.
Yeah, do you want to grab a mic? Over there.
Yeah, sure.
I don't care.
You're the one that got the most votes.
Okay, I've been designated the question reader. So we're going to start with the one that currently has the most votes. So can you speak a little bit more, clarify about the following from the presentation? Homestead tax rates are proportional to district per pupil spending decisions.
Yes. So a couple thoughts on that. One is, I will say that I intentionally did not include any equations or formulas in this slide deck. And we can certainly point you if you're looking for a more mathematical understanding of that. But essentially what that means is we have district per pupil spending, right? So say that you've got a district that's spending $100, and it has 20 weighted pupil. I'm not going to do math up here. Let's just say that we have 2 school districts, and they're both, one is really big, has a lot of weighted pupils, and one is really small and does not have a lot of weighted pupils. If those school districts are spending the exact same per pupil, they're going to have the exact same homestead property tax rate. And this is really part of our formula that's quite unique, is a district's tax rate does not depend at all on that district's property value, the value of that district's grand list. It really only depends on that district's per pupil spending and the yield that you all are setting in the yield bill. So this is, yes, complex, and also introduces equity into the system in the sense that regardless if you're the most rural district, if you're the most urban district, if you have the lowest grand list value or the highest grand list value, all of those districts, if they're spending the same per pupil, they're going to have the same homestead tax rate. Regardless of the district's characteristics, if one district spends a lot more per pupil, they're going to have a higher tax rate than a district that is not spending that much per pupil. Does that answer the question?
You're referring to equalized pupils, correct?
I'm referring, yes and no. Equalized pupils, so a few years ago, there was the passage of Act 127. So for those of you who are here, this updated the pupil weights. I actually thought there might be some questions about pupil weights, and I have a secret appendix where I've included a little bit more information about pupil weights. But essentially what they do is that they're used to adjust for different student circumstances or needs. And so they're adjusting for pupil counts. The funding formula has always used pupil weights. However, prior to Act 127, it was a different set of pupil weights, and then they became equalized pupils. Since the passage of Act 127, they're no longer called equalized pupils. There's new pupil weights that are being applied, and so now we refer to them as long-term weighted average daily membership, which is a mouthful.
All right, the next question. Can you please explain the impact that one-time buy-downs, such as this year's transfer from the general fund, have on the following year's property tax rates?
Yes, absolutely. So we can think of our property tax rates. There are some of a whole bunch of different things, right? That's what we just walked through. All of the things that come into the education fund, which makes it interesting and complicated. And so when we compare one year to the next year, in terms of property tax rates or property tax bills, we're comparing all of those factors that happened in the previous year with all of the factors that are happening in the current year. When one-time revenues are used to buy down property taxes, that's one piece of the puzzle that's impacting property tax rates in that year, which means that essentially, the way that I think about it is kind of artificially lowering those property tax rates in one year. They would have been higher, but you're putting in this one-time money to bring them lower. But getting back to Emily's comments from earlier, that's using one-time money for a recurring expense. So what that means is in the following year, if you're not using that one-time money, you're jumping back up to the base. And then if they're spending on top of that base, you're then also accounting for that spending. So it's sort of like this dip. You've got to get out of the dip, and then you can keep going up. Or down. You can also go down. Are we calling on people?
What, sorry, there's more questions coming in, and I got to look at them. Is there a follow-up, I guess?
Switch that one, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I may have missed this, and if so, I apologize, but the impact of Act 127, I know there was some impact this year. Is that for next year too, or is it just the first year?
So Act 127 permanently changed the pupil weights in statute until, or if, you decide to change statute again. So that means that pupil weights are now being counted per Act 127. The impact of that transition, originally in Act 127, there was a transition mechanism that was put into place last year. Actually, pre-town meeting, the General Assembly passed a bill that changed that transition mechanism. Essentially, what that does is school districts that had fewer weighted pupils than they did before, they're getting a penny discount on their rate over the course of 5 years. So we're currently in the second year of that 5-year phase down penny discount on homestead property tax rates.
All right, I'm going to move to the next question, and I will own that I just moved a whole bunch of questions, got moderated and moved to the front. So if people want to thumbs up them, they'll move up in the queue. But before we do that, what's the CLA that I keep hearing about?
So this is, I promise, the only other slide in my secret appendix. The CLA, what it really does is it adjusts each town's tax rate, so each town's homestead property tax rate and their non-homestead property tax rate, to ensure that property owners pay their fair share. What does that mean? Well, it means that we have a statewide education fund, but we don't have a statewide reappraisal system. So what that means is, across the state, properties are being appraised on different schedules, which means that you could have 2 neighbors with a town line in between, and they could have identical houses, but on the grand list, they could have very different values. And that would be because one town had recently reappraised, and the other town hadn't appraised for 5-10 years. So if we don't adjust that, it means that towns that are underappraised on the grand list are not going to be paying as much into the statewide education fund as they need to. So what the CLA does is it says, we're going to bring everybody up across the state, regardless of when you were last reappraised, to sort of the same playing field. We're going to perform a lot of math. It's called the equalization study. And we're going to essentially calculate, if you were to be appraised tomorrow, what is the estimate of what your house would be appraised, or your business, or your deer camp, what would it be appraised at? So the CLA is bringing everybody up. The one piece of the puzzle that I think makes things a little bit more complicated for that is it's intuitive to think, okay, it's adjusting property values, so we're adjusting property values on the tax bill. It's actually applied to the tax rate. The reasons for doing that are mostly ministerial. It makes it easier due to municipal property taxes as well. Mathematically, it's the same. So the CLA is really just ensuring that those property values are valued at what they should be, because it's a statewide fund. And I also included this bullet point that it's not a revenue-raising lever. It's not being adjusted in order to make one town pay more because of their local school. It's really being adjusted to ensure that a town is paying as much as it needs to pay into the statewide fund.
All right, we'll do one more maybe. Want to do one more?
Sure.
What happens if the yield bill doesn't pass?
Well, a little plug for JFO's website. I actually published an issue brief about this last session. It's written into statute. So what happens is if no yield bill passes, then the non-homestead property tax rate automatically reverts to $1.59, which is written into statute. And the homestead and income yields, that's the number that you all are passing to calculate those proportional tax rates, they revert to the prior year's yields. So that could mean that depending on everything else that's happening in the education fund, that could mean that the state raises way more in property tax revenue than they need to. It could mean that the state does not raise nearly enough and that the ed fund is running a deficit. It could also mean that the state is raising a ton on one class of property and not nearly so much on another class of property. So it depends on the year, but it means that the ed fund is not going to be funded to the level that we're aiming for. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Julia. This is going to be obviously a big topic of conversation this session, and we have a lot of resources on our webpage. You can email Ask JFO if you have questions or want to find out where some information is. And anyway, that will be an ongoing conversation. And so now let's move on to the next topic. We have 3 key figures in Vermont housing policy efforts. Please join me in welcoming Maura Collins, the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, Alex Farrell, the Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development, and Gus Seelig, the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board.
Hi there. Hi there. I'm Maura Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and I want to give you all credit for 2 things. 1, getting elected and being here today. 2, for trying out the questionnaire that we tried out a few minutes ago on questions. You are not done, though, with these exciting new tools. I'm going to be doing some polling with you all. So allow me to share my screen, and you are going to yet again see the picture of a beautiful groundbreaking there. And then in just a second, it's going to go to full screen mode. And you also are going to see the instructions. Hold on, we're going to try that one more time. Stop and share. Don't you love technology? Grab your phones, though, because what you're going to see is that we are going to have a poll here that is going to... Yep, you can grab, if you haven't gotten the, sorry. There we go. Sorry, it should switch in just a second. Okay, you will see in just a moment the instructions. Grab your phones. We're going to do a poll. Did I have it? And okay, there's a delay. That's what I'm going to be patient this time. Are we ready? It's on page 2 of their thing. Yes. So you can either grab your phone, and in a second, you're going to see up here a poll, and I want to know what you heard from your constituents when you were on the campaign trail. There are many topics that I'm sure you heard about, and my slides aren't advancing, but I'm going to be patient. And your choices, is the poll up, Mia, on their phones? Yep. So you will see that there are several choices. You probably heard about climate, energy, and environment. You may have heard, look at this, I have a backup plan. You may have heard about housing. You may have heard about property taxes or education. You may have heard about jobs. You may have heard about health care. You may have heard about other things such as transportation and the like. But with each of these, sorry, I really am going to get this. Yep. Can I figure out my, I have, sorry. I'm just going to share. It's that my slides aren't advancing. So there's my presentation, share. And there it is. When I switch to full screen levels, when I pulled up, but that's okay. Do this? Yeah. So that's okay. No, because I don't have a USB. I only have USB-C. Yeah. So what we're gonna. All right. No, I just want to do this. Mia, why aren't my results showing? Does everyone see my coworker, Mia Watson from VHFA? You will see her testifying in any kind of environment or energy committees. Okay, so I switched to the. No. You want to see your answers? Okay. Those are questions. I should be on the. There we go. What 2 questions? There we are. Thank you for your patience. We are trying new things. So, what 2 concerns? If you have it on your phone, you can say what the 2 concerns were, and you will start to see your answers when I click this. And so. Here we go. Are we ready to see what our concerns were? Okay. Now, can we all give the Joint Fiscal Office credit for knowing what topics you were hearing about most on the campaign trail? I think they had an idea that property taxes and education and housing were going to be the top 2 topics that you have to deal with. And so that's why we're here today. Now, similar to what Julia just talked about, we do want to flip this script and start with your questions. So please, like you just had a few moments ago, if you could start entering your questions. I'm going to move on and give you a little bit of data and talk to you a little bit about the housing needs in the state. But this is going to stay on your phones for a while here, where you can be entering questions. And they are anonymous, and the ones with the most thumbs up are the ones that are going to get answered in a few minutes. And speaking of questions that you may have, I'm going to start answering them with some resources that you want to know about and see some of the needs in the state. So you have probably heard that there's a need for 24,000 to 36,000 homes that we need in the state. That number came from the housing needs assessment that the Department of Housing and Community Development issues every 5 years. VHFA was the contractor for that this year. This chart here, I am going to try just one more time trying to get this to show up as a big screen. If it doesn't work, I'm giving up. You will see on that bar chart on the left that the blue bar shows that we need to replace constantly about 2,200 homes in the next 5 years, because there is such a thing as housing destruction. It's not just housing construction, there's housing destruction. Homes come offline, they're poor quality, they get run down, they stop being used as residences, they convert to commercial use or something else. So in the next 5 years, we have to build about 2,300 homes for that reason. The yellow bar shows that we have about 3,300 homeless households who are not counted in our housing units right now. They are not housed, and so we need to have homes for them. So we need to add to our housing market to accommodate those households. The gray bar shows that we need about 4,000 homes in the next 5 years to normalize our vacancy rates. Our vacancy rates are unhealthily low right now. There's not enough homes to rent or to purchase, and so we need to bring that vacancy rate up to something maybe closer to 3%. It's below 1% in much of our state. The orange and the blue bars are where most of what we need to add to our housing stock, what's driving that. And the orange bar shows that if you're someone who thinks that Vermont is going to be slow growing like we were before the pandemic and not add a lot more people, then you're going to be someone who thinks we only need 24,000 homes, because you're thinking that our growth will go back to what it was in the several years before the pandemic happened. But if you're a bullish person who says, no, I think that more out-of-staters are coming in, we're going to keep growing faster like we have been in the last 3 or 4 years since the pandemic, and you think our growth rate is going to stay at that higher level, then you're going to say that we need about 36,000 homes. I want to be very clear. We do not need to build or construct all those homes. Some of them exist today. Some of them are vacation homes that we want back for primary residences. Some of them may be short-term rentals. Some of them may be seasonal homes that we want to make year-round. Some of them might be school buildings that are being underutilized that we want to convert into housing. Some of them do need to be new construction. Some of them need to be homes that have come offline due to poor quality that we need to get back online due to some modest investments. And so we need to be making all those changes. On the right-hand side, you'll see the chart shows that this impacts rental and homeownership similarly. The blue bar shows what it would cost in order to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in the state of Vermont, and you can see that it's about $30 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment statewide. But you can see that the orange bar shows what the average renter wage is in Vermont, and it's just under $18 an hour. We're going to be talking about some of the affordable housing investments that the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and VHFA and the Department of Housing have jointly funded. And with that, you will find that the residents of those affordable apartments, on average, they earn $8 an hour. So when we talk about the low incomes and the needs out there, they are not being served by the marketplace generally. And at the bottom, you can see that it affects that it's not just renters, but also homeowners. We have tens of thousands of renters who are living in rental units who could afford to buy a home, but there is no housing stock available to them. And so you can see here that it used to be in 2021 that almost a third of our renters could have afforded the median priced home a couple years ago in 2021 at the going interest rates at the time. But because of increases in interest rates and increases in median home price, now it's only about 13% of our our renters can afford to buy a home. Now, I do apologize, this is not big, I cannot tell you why. But we do have a lot of resources available to you. You're gonna have a ton more questions, especially when it comes to housing data, and you can get answers through these links. And this presentation is on the JFO website, and so you could click these blue underlines and get these links. You can get a lot of my face in front of your computer screen if you want it. During the pandemic, let me tell you how I spent my time, which was, that's my basement. I started recording short little videos, less than 10 minutes, answering your housing questions, like what do all these state housing agencies do and why are they different from each other, and why is the cost of building affordable housing so expensive, and what does a state housing finance agency do? Because by the way, I got so flustered with my computer I didn't even tell you. So those are all answered on VHFA's YouTube page. Check them out. I happen to know that Representative Lamphere is a big fan of them. So they do answer your questions, and I'm going to use your questions that you're entering on your phones right now. I'm going to be using those to add more videos in the future. We also have a housing data website. We have the housing needs assessment I referenced. Alex is coming up next to talk about a dashboard. We have some regional housing targets coming out pretty soon. And we have the housing professionals you see in front of you, as well as the Housing and Homeless Alliance and other folks who are experts in the field. But there is an exciting new resource, and I'm going to pass the mic to my friend Alex here to introduce himself and to talk about the dashboard.
All right, thanks, Maura. So I'm Alex Farrell. I'm the commissioner at the Department of Housing and Community Development. Nice to see familiar faces here. So what we have up on the screen here is what we're still working on the name. As you can see, it's in development. This is what we're going to call the New Housing in Vermont dashboard. And what this does is it's going to provide us insight into housing that's being built as it's being built. So for a little context there, if you go to housingdata.org right now, that has all kinds of data, endless data, and I always push people there. One of those important pieces of data is building permits. This is something that the Census Bureau collects. We see this at the end of a year. The following May, we get to see what the prior year built. And so we've always racked our brain, how can we get better insight into what's being built throughout the year, and possibly even down the line, see what's in the pipeline, what's going to be built. In concert with this, we were tasked in the HOME Act and Act 181 with creating housing targets, so statewide and regional housing targets. We're working with VHFA's team on developing those now. And so this dashboard is going to serve to not only measure our progress against those targets, but also show us what's in the pipeline, what's being built. Do we need to turn things up? Do we need to cool things off? Do we need to change certain regulations? So we're only flashing this up now so that you know this is a resource in development. This is going to be a really important resource for us to watch because we've done so much, and Maura's going to talk about what you've all done to turn up the heat on housing in a thoughtful way, and now we want to make sure we did the right things, that it's having the right effect.
All right, I'm going to do another poll real quick, and I'm going to ask you a question that okay. When it comes to housing, what is most to blame? And you have these choices. Is it that the homes are not the right size, that we're over or under housed? Is it limited workforce? Hold on, this is cheating if you start to see people's answers. I'm gonna make you guess before you get to see everyone else's answers. Is it that it's a limited workforce is driving up the cost of housing? Is it those short-term rentals everyone loves to blame? Is it people moving to Vermont? Is it high cost? Is it lack of infrastructure? Is it regulations? Poor condition or quality, opposition to housing like NIMBYism, or too few homes. 29, let's see, 10 of you have voted so far. I need to see more votes before I show you the answer. If anyone remembers last year that we were up here giving a presentation and I asked a similar question, but we didn't actually poll you, but I did ask which one of these do you think is most to blame? 30 of you, come on, a few more. I want to see like 10 more. I'm like the VPR, or sorry, Vermont Public person, before I show you the answers. Do you want to know what is most to blame? Ready? Here we go, last chance to show. Ooh, 13 votes for cost, high cost, materials, interest rates, and labor, and too few homes. So now do you want to know what the right answer is? Because I have the answer. That's what's coming next. The right answer is on my next slide. And the right answer share my screen, is that if anyone was here last year, you would know that no matter what you chose, you're right. So, no matter what you picked, you can see the link at the bottom of the screen, and you will see that that is the slide deck from last year's presentation where we talked about housing. And again, you have that link. If you go to the JFO website, you'll see this presentation, and you'll see it. There's a slide on every single one of those causes, and it will show you using last year's data that no matter which one you picked, it is impacting the housing market. This is the perfect storm. All these things are happening. They're happening at once, which is why you all are charged with acting on all these things. Additionally, the good news is that the legislature in the past 2 years, for those of you who've been in the legislature in the past 2 years, you should know the good news that you have taken steps to address every single one of these items. And I'm going to quickly tell you about why, and I'm going to share it with Alex and Gus, who will jump in. So the first one is you have recognized that we don't have the right size of homes. I want to grab the stat from the needs assessment. That in the needs assessment, it shows that 17% of Vermont households are traditional nuclear families with 2 adults and kids in them. That's 17% of our state's households are 2 adults with kids. That means the rest of the households are singles, couples, no kids, adult roommates. So while only 17 of us are adults with kids at home, 59% of our homes are large single-family homes that cater to those larger households. So we have a real mismatch in the size of our homes and the types of households that we have. And so to address that, you all did a lot of things. One of the things you did was you funded more the construction of for-sale homes through a middle-income homeownership development program that VHFA has administered. And we funded about just under 140 homes. They built very modest homes. They're on average about 1,300 square feet. They're going to be for sale. A lot of habitat homes, shared equity homes through nonprofits, but also private developers who set aside a couple homes in their bigger developments so that some of those units could be affordable. To address the limited workforce, you all have done several things. You've funded a rental revolving loan fund, another middle income program, where through that program, you've lured in employer resources and municipal dollars for housing that would not have been dedicated to housing but for this program. With a very modest investment of a subsidized loan to the developers, now we have some rental housing that's affordable to people who wouldn't qualify for the other government subsidized housing that we fund through tax credits. It's for a middle income program. Additionally, in yellow, you can see, because I wanted you to see it, that's a link. VHFA just published a few months ago an employer-assisted housing guide. We presented it at the Vermont Chamber Conference, and we talked to employers through this guide about what they can be doing to contribute to addressing our housing needs. When it comes to short-term rentals, you all put a fee on short-term rentals that just went into effect, I believe it was in August of this year, and we're going to watch the data to see how much revenue can be generated through that and what the impact on short-term rentals are. And I want to highlight an article that VHFA has written about the understanding vacant homes in the state, because Vermont has the second highest proportion of homes that are vacant in the state, but not all of them are perfectly adequate for housing, and so understanding vacancy in that way and vacation homes is important. You also have been, people moving to Vermont. You have not put up a wall around Vermont, thank you very much. We are still welcoming more residents, which is adding to the vibrancy and diversity of our state, which is appreciated. Because too often, the latest entrants to our state, the folks who have moved here most recently, sometimes get an unfair share of the blame. If you remember that orange and blue bar that was really driving much of our housing needs, that's not made up of people moving to Vermont. That's households like mine, where we got divorced 2 years ago. And you know what that means? My family now needs 2 homes, okay? It also means some household like yours, where something tells me a couple of you are still living in the family home, even though maybe your kids aren't there with you anymore, and you may be a little overhoused, okay? And your kids now are taking up homes, hopefully in this state, that were used to be in your home. It's Vermonters who are adding to the number of new households by our shrinking household size, and not people necessarily moving into our state. And the last one I wanted to cover on cost. There's a lot you've all done on cost. Alex is going to talk to it, but VHFA and the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, in partnership with VITA, the Economic Development Authority, is coming out in just another 2 weeks with a report on manufactured off-site housing. It does a look at what has happened in Vermont, what's happening today, and what some recommendations are to look at panelized off-site construction. That's going to tee you all up for January so you can be looking at those models to address cost.
Okay, so one of the reasons that's going to be really important, that manufactured and off-site construction report, is because there's a lot of interest in this. Could this speed up the rate of home building? Could this allow us to build homes with recognition of this labor shortage? Could it possibly be more affordable to build? One of the ways that we've sort of piloted this concept, Joint Fiscal Committee appropriated $7 million to go to the Agency of Transportation in cooperation with the Vermont State Housing Authority to administer a rapid response mobile home infill program. And this is essentially the state bulk purchasing manufactured homes, leveraging AOT's contractors to prep lots in different mobile home parks throughout the state, and then placing these and then making them available for homeowners throughout the state under 120% of the area median income to purchase those at whatever it costs the state, or in this case, Vermont State Housing Authority. So that's an early attempt to sort of leverage bulk purchasing through manufactured housing. Some of these others going down the list. Lack of infrastructure. This is something that, as some of our land use regulations have changed, we've really turned and noticed that there's a lot that we need to invest in our infrastructure to allow for housing to be built. Luckily, you've done a lot here. There's the Healthy Homes Program, brownfields. Those are really making sure that buildings are healthier and water's cleaner and safer. TIF is a tool that's been used to fund infrastructure that then allows housing to be built. So there's a lot that's been done there, and there's a lot of focus there because rightly we know that we need to do a lot more to help support infrastructure for housing. Going down the list here, bylaw modernization grants and municipal planning grants. So as we look at the regulatory environment, we've made a lot of changes here at the state level. Those changes are affecting our municipalities. We need to give them the tools to catch up and make sure that what they have on the books matches what we've done here in this building. And some of these folks are trying to go above and beyond that to enable more housing built more densely. So these grants give municipalities the tools to do that. And then regulation, again, I really need to flag the monumental changes that you all made with two significant bills, the Home Act in 2023 and then Act 181 last year. I'm going to dive into those a little bit more in a moment, but these were monumental. I even made the font bigger. That tells you how monumental they were. And what's important about those is those not only addressed our regulatory challenges, but it also recognized the fact that NIMBYism has crept into our zoning and our land use, and we have to confront that and actively work against that. And then I'm going to touch on the poor condition and quality of our homes briefly in a couple slides here, but the two programs I'm going to discuss are the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, VHIP. If you've seen me in this building, you've heard me say VHIP. And then the Manufactured Home Improvement and Repair Program. That's improving homes in manufactured home parks and improving the parks themselves. Oh, thanks, Maura. Okay, so to touch on these two monumental pieces of legislation that you passed on land use and zoning, I'm going to start with the Home Act. This was 2023. And if you're thinking about these two bills, they sort of work together in that the Home Act was really focused on the municipal level, making sure that our municipal zoning enabled dense construction. So you can see some examples of what it did. Now, it was an extensive bill. It was very thoughtful, and it did a lot. So this is not an exhaustive list of everything that it did, but it did things like duplexes are now permitted statewide. Anywhere where single-family zoning exists, you may duplex within that same footprint. Where there's water and wastewater, you must allow single-family homes to be built on no larger than 1/5 of an acre. That's significant. ADUs, no review where there's no single-family home review. It capped parking requirements so that you can't put burdensome parking requirements, especially where there's water and wastewater. So all of this goes towards more density, building where we have the infrastructure and not expanding out where we don't need to. Looking to the second bill, Act 181 of 2024. So now this is turning more towards the state permitting. What can we do with state land use to make sure that that aligns with everything that we did to create more allowances for density in the municipal level? So Act 181, the biggest thing that this did was retool the way Act 250 jurisdiction applies to make it location-based. And so you've probably heard about the 3 tiers. There's plenty of time to dive into the 3 tiers later in the session, but for now you can think of Tier 1 as centers where we're going to allow for more density. You can build housing without needing to go through Act 250. Tier 2 is largely going to be the same as it is now, with the addition of now what's called a road rule. Again, we're not going to dive into that right this moment. And then Tier 3 is going to be some additional jurisdictions and protections in areas for conservation. So nice job, monumental pieces of legislation. So to dive into those couple of programs, Maura alluded to not only poor condition, but also a mismatch with our housing stock. One of the tools that we're using to improve the condition of and reshape our housing stock is the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, VHIP. So just quickly, this is a program that could bring units online that have fallen into disrepair. It could take that large single-family home, 5-bedroom Victorian, turn it into 3 rental units. Or it could be converting a commercial space. We have all these downtowns with commercial and retail spaces on 2nd and 3rd floors that aren't being used. This program can give you a grant up to $50,000 to convert those into residential housing. So, some quick stats on VHIP. It's created about 500 units, all of which have gone to folks exiting homelessness, with the exception of about 30. There is another 500 or so in the pipeline right now. 80% of those are going to go to folks exiting homelessness. And these are grants that are about $44,000 a piece. Again, because this is redevelopment, this is using existing structures, we're able to keep that cost a little lower and ask the property owner to kick in a little share themselves. Going to the next program, the Manufactured Housing Improvement and Repair Program. So there's been an acknowledgement, and Gus's team and ours have worked really closely to invest in manufactured home communities throughout the state because this has been a long neglected piece of our housing stock. Mobile homes are a naturally occurring, affordable housing option for folks, and this opens up home ownership options for folks that might not otherwise be able to reach home ownership, especially given the stats that Maura shared. So we're trying to make a concerted effort to invest in these. And so you can see the 3 ways in which we invest in these communities here is home repairs. This is keeping folks in their home who are precariously housed. This might be, a window that's been leaking. It could be an issue with the roof. But these are about $8,000 to $10,000 grants, making sure these people stay in happy, healthy homes. This can also invest in the infrastructure of the park to make sure that the park stays healthy. And there's a renewed focus on expanding some of these parks. So there's infill grants to create new lots where people can place a new home. So actually growing the stock in these. And again, you can see almost $7 million obligated here. So I'm going to pass it off to my friend Gus so he can keep talking about some of the successes.
Thank you very much, Alex and Maura. It's great to be back here again. I'm surprised you want to hear from us yet another year. But the time is right to do that. And Catherine, I think you wanted us to be taking questions just about now, so I'm going to go as fast as I possibly can to get through these slides. Our statutory purpose is up there, but the story I want to tell about this slide is that 3 communities, Shaftesbury, where the housing, the folks you see in that picture, are located, upzoned a parcel, 2.5 acres, let them build 23 homes on it. The town of North Bennington, the village of North Bennington provided their access to their water system and the town of Bennington to the sewage system to make that possible. They're about a 10-minute walk from the North Bennington School and a 3-minute walk to that recreation area that you see there. So wanted to talk just for that moment about how we we combine housing and conservation in one rural community. Shaftesbury didn't have its own infrastructure, but made housing possible. Big picture, what have you done? Where did the money go that you gave us all over the last few years? And almost all of our projects are joint efforts one way or another. Maura has access to and utilizes federal tax credits that go into rental development, some home ownership tax credits that you've provided. Alex's office administers the Community Development Block Grant Program for lots of revitalization projects. So far, we've invested $365 million in 4,500 homes and apartments and shelter beds all over the state. I'm not going to try to read the breakdown there, but it's covered every part of the state. The picture there you see is a project in Bristol, which a private sector fellow wanted to do, and he couldn't make it pencil. And we and Evernorth and the Addison organization we work with jumped in to make it happen when he was ready to abandon it. So just to keep moving along, because we want to go fast. This is the one slide where I'll talk about conservation at all. The flooding you see is a federal housing development built in the 1960s, not in the floodplain, but in the floodway. And that's what happened during Tropical Storm Irene. The site has been abandoned. We built together the housing above near the high school in Brattleboro. And 2 weeks ago, I was with Secretary Moore in Brattleboro in another neighborhood where we bought 12 acres from Sir Sassomo Lumber, took out the berm, took away a ton of fill, and that's going to provide a place for the brook to go when the waters rise too fast and not cause all the damage that has been caused. And if you talk to folks in Barry or Johnson, we're going to need to do more work of this kind. So the issue of resilience, of flood recovery, is also a place where we're going to need some nature-based solutions to make things work going down the road. A lot of our work, those of you who have been around, is about smart growth, historic preservation, revitalization. We're all working together on the building that's been empty in Bennington, the old high school, for 30 years with a development team, and we're hopeful that we'll see construction this spring. On the right is the old Bellows Falls garage. We could only save the facade. It's the third major investment we've made in the village of Bellows Falls, but there's 27 gorgeous apartments there today because of your investment. Okay. Lots of projects in development. In Windsor, there's a building going up right next to the diner. There's also a piece of our work that's vitally important. In fact, the reason we got going all those years ago in the mid-'80s, Copley Terrace. This was owned by Copley Health Systems. They were ready to convert it to market rate workforce housing because they're having problems. You read about that in the healthcare report. But there were 40 elderly residents who depended on the Section 8 assistance that goes with this development, and instead they've decided at a much lower cost than replacement to let a nonprofit buy it and keep it as affordable housing and not displace those elderly people, some of whom had been in from the beginning when it first opened close to 40 years ago. Soon to be completed, 65 new apartments at 40th and Allen at one end of the state, and 2 recovery residences for people struggling with addiction in Bennington. That'll be among 58 beds statewide, along with an elder project in Heinsberg. We know none of it is happening fast enough, but over just these 3 months, as we were reporting the joint fiscal, close to 300 homes. I spent 2 weeks traveling the state at the late June and beginning of July, where we either broke ground or celebrated the grand opening of close to 260 apartments and shelter beds all over the state. So over this year and next, close to 1,000 units we are requiring people to make some of those units available for people experiencing homelessness. This hotel in Barry is one of about a dozen that we're, in this case, converting to a shelter for the GA program, but in other cases to apartments, and we think it also has the potential down the road to be apartments rather than to continue to be a shelter. Putney, I'm going to take a moment to talk about this. And the reason I want to talk about Putney is because there was just the second Supreme Court decision to let it go forward. And the question I want to put forward to you is, when you have a public process and the town of Putney decides, here's where we want our village to be developed, and you get a village center designation, and then that's approved by the Regional Planning Commission and recommended to Alex's board at the state level to give it that designation in a third public process, should we really have to spend $75,000 fighting about building 25 apartments in that location? When should we give people the right to build? And I think that's a question you need to reckon with as a legislature. I'd say let's have the fights in the planning process. Let's have them, but once we've made those decisions that this is where development ought to happen, we need not spend 2 years in court. And what I can promise you, having funded this before there was an appeal, is that they're going to come back to all of us because they're going to be a good $3-4 million short, because that's how much the cost has gone up in the 2 years we spent on lawyers fighting about this. You've asked us to expand shelter capacity and to make it more healthy all over the state, and that's been done. 10 new shelters across the state have been funded. This is the first one in Lamoille County. There was another new one in St. Johnsbury. Those would not have happened but for the Homes Act, where you said communities can no longer zone out shelters. So thank you for that as well. Alex talked already about manufactured home communities and doing infill. That's been another piece of our work. So we're glad to see further expansion of that work all over the state. Farm worker housing. This has been an issue that has not had attention, and it's one of the places one-time money went over recent years, and we'll have a question of can we sustain that effort, but it's been really important from an equity perspective and important to the farmers themselves, whose margins are so thin that it's just really hard to invest in housing. I'm not going to go through all the housing programs that we work on together, but I love this picture. He's a resident at Bellows Falls, and while I've been showing you buildings, this is all about people. This is all about your constituents, our family, our friends, our neighbors, and new Vermonters. A lot of our work is about creating village centers, sometimes where there hasn't been one. Dick Mazza was really excited to see this housing really form a village in South Hero. It's adjacent to, or right nearby, about a 5-minute walk to the community health center, to the library, and the fire station. Really helped define a village. Those of you who know and work with Steve Klein, if you want to know what he's doing now that he's not here anymore, he's working with CV Ron, an organization help supporting Afghan refugees in Montpelier. The market here has been so constrained that he and his group asked us for some support so that when a house came on the market, they didn't have to have a contingency. They could go just buy it. And this is one of the 3 units that they and Down Street have helped get for refugee families so they could stay in this community. This is another downtown development in Waterbury. A piece of it will be support for adults with intellectual disabilities. A piece of it will be for housing for people who've experienced homelessness, and 18 apartments will be for whoever qualifies by income. The Village of Waterbury actually had a public vote to support this project, and again, the Homes Act made it possible. There was an initial vote by the zoning board to say no, and then they changed their minds, I think in part as they understood what the law required. A piece of the charge you give my organization is that when we invest the state funds, that it be permanent community asset. And I'm not going to go through the numbers here. This development was actually developed by the Housing Finance Agency many years ago. It's the Officers Row housing at 40th and Allen. But what we did in 1993 was to make an investment to get somebody into a $90,000 home when we did the rehabs of just over $13,000. It has sold twice since then, but because of shared appreciation, although the value has about tripled, the value of that subsidy has increased from $13,000 to $180,000. So the newest home buyer was able to get in at $182,000. And that's the power of, and I think the fiscally conservative approach to how we use our dollars to make sure assets stay affordable rather than losing them to the market. We're experimenting with permanent supportive housing. This is on Main Street in Burlington, done by the Committee on Temporary Shelter. But by investing in social housing, one of the things you've asked us to do is to ask the providers of that social housing not just to obey the governor's executive order to provide 15% of the apartments to people who'd been unhoused, but really to up their game, which has caused some strain, I have to say. But because of that resource being there as permanent affordable housing, almost 1,500 households across the pandemic since 2021 have been brought in as units turned over. And I think that's been a great savings to the GA program, to the motel program, and a great investment in public health as well, because we know people just don't do well health-wise when they are unhoused. Kids who are unhoused and move from school to school don't do well. One of the things that Representative Marcotte and former Chair Janet Ansell worked on was to find funding for the career tech ed programs. That's the governor in Newport on the very first project. A great partnership is happening with Habitat for Humanity, both with the Randolph Tech Ed program, which is what's pictured here, but also with the Barry Tech Ed program as well. And part of your response of we need more workforce to help solve the problem of the high costs. There's a big pipeline today. What I'm going to say to you is that that pipeline is going to slow down because developers are not going to spend their money getting ready for projects for which there will not be subsidy. And so I think that's one of the challenges ahead. This is just another project in Highgate, Vermont that, again, is going to help really support a village center that'll be under construction, I think, this spring. This is my last slide. I'm going to pass it back to Maura. But for all of you who are really concerned about the environment in Vermont, I want to say a couple things here. This is Cambrian Rise, private sector-led development, the most mixed-income neighborhood in the state of Vermont, I think, because the condos that SD Ireland is building right now are in the millions of dollars. We're involved in 3 buildings there that are affordable housing at the far end. This happened in part because we also conserved 12 acres that the city now owns right along the lake, public park, public path through there for the residents of the Old North End. But the point here I want to make is about density. The density here is 75 homes per acre. So if you're worried about sprawl, if you're worried about the impact on our environment, we only need 500 acres if we build to this density to meet the 35,000 unit goal. We don't have to screw up Vermont's environment to meet our housing needs. Even if we go down to what Shaftesbury did, and we're doing 7 or 8 units per acre, we only need 5,000 acres. We have the room and ability to do this if we do it in a thoughtful, smart way. I've already talked about the permit process. We will be in your committees, and Mia in particular, talking about we need more equity in energy policy. We need access to energy resources that we currently have. We will need, as both of my colleagues have said, more assistance for infrastructure. The city of Montpelier bought the old golf course. They'd like to put hundreds of units up there. It's going to take a major upgrade to get this, and I think I've heard more than $6 million for the sewer line to serve that site for that much housing adequately. And there are examples like that all over the state where that would be an important thing to do. And then the last thing I'm going to leave you with in really hard, more difficult fiscal times is that my organization was created in the 1980s when the Reagan administration had cut the HUD budget by 80%, cut the Land and Water Conservation Fund by 90%. We're ready for this moment where we're going to have less federal partnership. I think we can all expect that. But Vermont has made a commitment to take care of its own, going back many years, and we're going to need more capital, or the progress that you've seen is going to really slow down. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Maura, and thank you. We look forward to being in all your committees. I think every committee has a role to play in this, whether you're human services, healthcare, housing, natural resources, energy. There's something for each of you to do. Even transportation in terms of access to infrastructure dollars. There's something for each of you to do to help make our work and the work of welcoming Vermonters to their homes a little bit easier.
And now we get to the questions and answers. Thank you to all of you who have been entering questions along the way, and thanks for the thumbs up. The one that got the most thumbs up is this question on the screen you see now. Why are we not placing more taxes on owners of multiple properties and second homes in the state? This seems like a workable solution that the Ed Fund problem, oh, there's more to it, but workable solution. I mean, are you serious that you think that's a question for us? Which one of you wants to take the mic? I will tell you some data about vacation homes. And I will tell you that, as I said before, about 16% of the state's housing stock are vacation homes. A lot of those are deer camps. They're seasonal. They don't have the kind of sewer. They're on the lake, so their septic systems are not year-round and all that. So don't, get too excited that we can get our hands on all of them. But a lot of them are homes that could be housing year-round Vermonters. And I think it's a really fair question to say that if it scares us to think about building tens of thousands of units, then we do need to be looking at reusing some of our properties, whether they be residences, commercial, schools, as I mentioned, and looking at using those in different ways. But I think this is a really fair question that can address this. So the next question, why was there not a housing shortage 5 years ago? I love this question. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to answer this one too, and then I promise I'll pass off the next one to you guys. There was, and y'all weren't, none of us were paying attention. Well, a few of us were. A few of us were doing housing needs assessments and saying, we're heading for a brick wall, everyone. The brick wall's getting closer. The needs are getting worse. I could show you a chart, and in fact, it was in the presentation from a year ago. If you go and look at that link I put on the slide, and it shows that in the 80s, which was not even the high water mark for construction in the state, but in the 80s, we were building 1.8% of our housing stock was new and coming online. That's almost 2% of our homes were coming online every year throughout that decade. And there's a chart that shows that every year that construction got lower and lower. And since 2000, in the past 20 years, it's gone down to 0.6% of our homes are coming online. So we have not been keeping up with the pace of construction, and it has not kept up with that shrinking household size. So even if our population is growing just meagerly, if the number of people in each home shrinks, we need more homes. And so it is not COVID that broke the housing market. Interest rates haven't helped, and cost escalations haven't helped, but it's not that this was not a problem 5, 10, 15 years ago. It's that it hadn't reached a fevered pitch. But now I think what we used to see was that it affected people at the lowest income band. Organizations like all of ours and your CAP agencies and others, I think knew that people were struggling with housing easily 5, 10 years ago. But it was only hurting people who were in deep, deep poverty. And then I started hearing from some of you that some of your kids who went to college and had 4-year degrees, they weren't able to move out of your basements. And then I started hearing from employers who said, I pay a good wage, we're talking 6 figures, and I can't get them to move to our state. And then it really started hitting a fevered pitch when we have very prominent people in state government and others who are really succeeding and contributing in the state, earning good money and all that, and they couldn't find housing. So as it affects more people, I think it became more and more aware. The next question, why is housing so expensive? I scrolled past one. Why is housing so expensive? I saw it and I pushed a button and Mia's mad at me right now. Who wants to address why housing is so expensive? So I'm not the only one answering.
I think there's lots and lots of reasons. My friend Jeannie Morrissey, who owns a construction company, says it's great that the guys she works with are making good money today, but there are less and less people swinging hammers, wiring our homes, plumbing our homes. Any of you who've tried to call a contractor, you're lucky if they're going to start next spring. Even if they've worked for you 2 or 3 times in the past and you need a modest renovation. So there's a shortage on the workforce side. Supply chain interruptions made a big difference. The cost of interest when you have to borrow when you're doing construction was 3% a couple of years ago. This year it was 9%. So when you have to, and if you have a supply chain interruption, we had a great building in downtown St. Johnsbury, was supposed to open in June one year. The elevator didn't arrive. When it finally arrived in October, the labor didn't show up to get it installed for another month. So an extra almost 6 months of interest on a $15 million project makes costs go up. All kinds of things are driving cost here. There's no doubt that, in my mind, the influx of some people with a lot of money into the state also drove the price of real estate up. But this is not just a Vermont phenomena. When I talk to my colleagues across the northern tier in New England, when I talk to my colleagues across the country, we're seeing this. This is a nationwide problem, not just a Vermont problem.
I think we all know I'm going to add on to that and just say that we say what we're funding is affordable housing, but some of you in the housing committees have seen my iceberg visual where we're not telling the full story when we say what we're funding is affordable housing. Because what we're really doing is below the water line, and it's things like we're remediating brownfields and we're remediating blight and cleaning up brownfields. We're helping the state reach its Global Warming Solutions Act goals, because we're using less greenhouse gases. We are doing so much more. We're addressing healthcare through housing people who are homeless, addressing the education needs of our students when they're in stable, safe and secure housing. So we're doing more than that. But there are things Vermont can do to lower the cost of housing, and you've started doing it. You started looking at density, which Gus spoke to, and the more homes you can put on a parcel of land, that lowers costs. And investing in infrastructure will lower the cost of housing, because housing doesn't have to bear the cost of all that infrastructure. And I think I saw the infrastructure was our next question. What regulatory or other hurdles impede construction of tiny houses in tiny house neighborhoods?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's actually been great steps taken to enable more of this. I mean, really the biggest barriers historically have been zoning regulations that don't allow a certain density. And so I think in a lot of rural Vermont, we have in our minds this idea of a single family home that sits on half an acre and it's, 2,000 square feet. But I think folks are taking a hard look at if that really is what has to be the reality for Vermonters now. I mean, I visited a great, fairly new construction building in White River Junction. Those homes are all about 600, 650 square feet. These are rental homes, but it's plenty of space. It's very efficient. And frankly, a lot of our population is looking for something like that. So I think that logic carries for single family homes, but our zoning needs to follow through to make sure that that density is allowed. It's great that in the Home Act and then with some clarifications in Act 181, we now say municipalities must allow at least, no more than a fifth of an acre for a single family home. That's still a lot of space. A fifth of an acre, granted I grew up in Chittenden County, but a fifth of an acre is plenty of space. And so for thinking about tiny home communities, and in a way, we have a bit of a model with manufactured home communities and the density that we've seen there's a lot that can be achieved if that density is allowed. Now, again, I'm just going to come back to the infrastructure is still going to be a challenge because we're still going to need to bring the infrastructure into those parcels. Now, where there's water and wastewater, we have a leg up because that's going to make it more affordable, and thus we've connected almost all of our regulatory reforms in some way to parcels where there's access to water and wastewater. But again, increasing the capacity where we have those, and then making sure that there's probably more tools to help fund that infrastructure investment is really going to be the work that we're all going to need to do together over the next year or two. Anything to add?
All right, next up. How much does NIMBYism play a role in our housing shortage? Do you want to take this one, Gus?
Well, the good news is that we're seeing lots of communities, and I use the Shaftesbury example as one where the community is very supportive. But when it's a problem, it's a huge problem. Senator Clarkson knows the story in Woodstock where two neighbors had a lawyer who was very good and was willing to work, I think, for free. Pro bono for 10 years, and it took us 10 years to get 36 apartments permitted in Woodstock. It made 2.5 trips to the Supreme Court. So when it's a problem, it's a huge problem. Putney, and in that case, the town of Woodstock and the school district actually had a vote to provide access, I think, for a water line. So the communities are often very supportive, but we give a huge amount of power to any neighbor in Vermont to object. And that's why we last year told some of you about a model where New Hampshire has a housing board of appeals. They have to make decisions within 6 months. There are other examples in Vermont where we have used quasi-judicial forms, Public Utilities Commission, the Human Services Board to settle disputes. The court system is very slow and very expensive. So I think that's one of the issues we need to look at. There are lots of communities trying to welcome housing. St. Albans has done a great job with its TIF district. So just told you Montpelier bought the old golf course with the intention of doing housing there. We're seeing lots of communities want to do the right thing. We're seeing private people in Heinsberg make donations of land. So we're seeing lots of good stuff happen, but we give a lot of power to anybody to object to things, and that's why I said, let's have the fights in the planning process. Once we've set the plans, let's let people build.
So our final poll, because we're out of time, is one where you have to grab your phones again. This isn't a question. There's going to be a poll here. And I want to know how much you think housing impacts each of these sectors. So again, if you haven't gone to menti.com, you can type in that 7164 number, 4420, and you can say, is there no impact at all? I think is 0, and the highest number is the highest impact. How much do you think housing impacts farms and forestry, job growth, public safety, education, environment, healthcare, human services availability, or transportation costs? Looks like we don't have enough votes yet, so I need more of you to respond. Oh, there we go. Now they're coming in. All right, I'm going to show you the answer. I know this is going back to my UVM teaching days. All right, tell me how much housing impacts each of these sectors. Let's see, are we ready for the results? You're still voting? Okay, here we go. Man, they're coming in fast and furious. All right, here we go. Look at that. Housing impacts every single one of these sectors. So there is not a committee in this building that shouldn't be hearing from the housing professionals to talk about how your work in your committees is going to impact housing. If you're looking at energy policy, you should be thinking about how that's going to impact housing costs. You should be thinking about equity in housing. You should be thinking about the benefits and incentives that you're creating through the programs that you are talking about in your committee, and how is it going to impact housing? Because I could bring you back to the poll slide that reminds you that this is what your constituents were talking about. They were talking about affordability through their property taxes and the education costs, and they're talking about the affordability of housing. And so I encourage you to reach out to all of us and our peers in the broader housing network, the developers, the realtors, the home builders, the nonprofits, and talk about the impacts of what you're doing on housing. Thank you very much for having us, and I'll turn it back to Catherine.
Thank you, Maura, Alex, and Gus. Thank you all for coming. We have one public service announcement that Molly is going to share with House members.
Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Moore. I work with the Speaker's Office. For all of our 2023-2024 members, the desks on the House floor will be cleaned out. You have until the end of the day on Saturday to clean out your desks here on the House floor. Anything left behind at the end of the day on Saturday will be removed and discarded. We're doing this so that BGS can clean and repair all of the desks. So please get that done today or by the end of the day on Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you again. We hope you've learned something from today. And if you have questions, email Ask JFO. We look forward to working with you in January. Thank you.